Republican Congressman Chris Collins from Western New York was the first sitting member of Congress to back Donald Trump's presidential bid. He did so way back in February 2016. He was such a strong supporter of Mr. Trump. Collins, at the Republican National Convention, was asked to formally second Mr. Trump's nomination to be his party's nominee.
I have the honor of seconding the nomination of Donald J. Trump as the next President of the United States of America.
But today, Congressman Chris Collins was arrested by the FBI. Moments ago, the congressman walked out of federal court in New York City, where he'd been arraigned. Prosecutors this afternoon detailing the grand jury indictments of the New York Republican, his son, and his son's fiance's father for 13 counts of securities fraud, wire fraud, and false statements, all stemming from an alleged insider trading scheme involving an Australian biotech firm for which Collins was a board member. And it's difficult not to notice that the president, who repeatedly declared himself the law and order candidate on the campaign trail, whose crowds continue to enthusiastically chant that his erstwhile opponent, Hillary Clinton, should be locked up, that president sure seems to have a lot of people in his orbit who seem to run afoul of the law. Beyond his first congressional backer arrested just in the last day, the president's former deputy campaign chairman, Rick Gates, was testifying about crimes he says he committed with President Trump's former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort. Plus, CNN also has learned that the president's former fixer and longtime attorney, Michael Cohen, is under federal investigation for tax fraud. That's just the last day. Now, on the one hand, the public can seemingly be reassured that American institutions of law enforcement continue to do their jobs, pursuing criminality wherever they see it, without fear or favor, with no evidence of any inappropriate influence being wielded to protect those who are close to the president. That's good news. On the other hand, those who enthusiastically thought electing President Trump might mean he would drain the swamp, they likely didn't believe so many of those critters in the swamp were the president's friends and allies. I want to bring in CNN's Bryn Gingras, who's live outside the federal courthouse, where moments ago Collins made his first court appearance. And Bryn, we just learned that Collins is going to hold a press conference in a couple hours.
Yeah, that's right, Jake. At 6:30 in Buffalo, and we saw the congressman and his team of attorneys come out this federal courthouse here behind me, jump into an SUV, likely headed in that direction for that press conference. But inside the courtroom, the congressman, his 25-year-old son Cameron, and his soon-to-be father-in-law all appeared calm when they pleaded not guilty to the judge. But anything but calm is what prosecutors say all three men were when they learned about this drug and how it failed the clinical trial and the alleged swift action they took to unload their stocks and save hundreds of thousands of dollars, according to the prosecutors, doing all this above the law, thinking they were above the law. Republican Congressman Chris Collins, the first member of Congress to support Donald Trump, appearing in court late this afternoon after federal prosecutors charged him, his son Cameron, and another man, Stephen Zarsky, with 13 counts of securities fraud, wire fraud, and making a false statement to the FBI. The charges stemming from an alleged insider trading scheme,
First Lady,
which partially played out on the South Lawn of the White House, according to court documents. At the center of it all, an Australian pharmaceutical company called Innate Immunotherapeutics, where Collins was a board member.
Congressman Collins was told some confidential and highly sensitive information about Innate, information that was not yet made public, namely that Innate's main drug, the drug Innate was developing to be the backbone of its company, was a total failure.
According to the 30-page complaint, that conversation happened while Collins attended the annual congressional picnic at the White House. Federal prosecutors say Collins received an email at 6:55 p.m. that the drug had failed its trial. At 7:10 p.m., Collins responded to the email and then proceeded to try to reach his son Cameron, the two placing 6 calls over a period of 5 minutes. Later that night, Cameron drove to the home of Stephen Zarsky, the father of his fiancée. And at 9:34 p.m., Zarsky's wife placed a call to their stockbroker to sell shares of the company, according to the complaint. Prosecutors allege that between the opening of the market on Friday, June 23rd, and the close of business on the following Monday, Cameron Collins sold a total of nearly 1.4 million shares of Innate. All in all, prosecutors allege that Collins and the other defendants avoided more than $750,000 in losses on the stock.
Congressman Collins cheated our markets and our justice system in 2 ways. First, he tipped his son to confidential corporate information at the expense of regular investors, and then he lied about it to law enforcement to cover it up.
Collins, who represents upstate New York, became a frequent Trump surrogate on cable news during the 2016 campaign. His lawyers saying in a statement, quote, "We will answer the charges filed against Congressman Collins in court and will mount a vigorous defense to clear his good name. We are confident he will be completely vindicated and exonerated." Now, each of the men had to sign over a $500,000 personal recognizance bond, and they each had to turn over their passports. Jake, as you heard, the attorneys for both Cameron and the congressman vehemently deny these allegations. Of course, though, we'll hear more from the congressman when he appears for that news conference in Buffalo around 6:30. Jake?
All right, Bryn Gingras in New York, thanks so much. Let's talk about with our panel. I want to set the scene for a second because Bryn did mention this White House. None of this has to do with President Trump directly, of course, but on June 22nd, 2017, that's when prosecutors say Congressman Collins got that email, including insider information, and started calling his son. It just so happens Collins was at the congressional picnic at the White House, surrounded by his colleagues, tons of people. Look at this part. This was at 7:30. Everyone's taking pictures. Collins looks a little distracted. Perhaps he's looking down at his phone. This is exactly 14 minutes after Collins, according to prosecutors, called his son to give him the tip. I mean, it really is remarkable. Again, innocent until proven guilty, but people seem to think that there aren't going to be investigations or records of these things.
I mean, the term that people use, a culture of corruption, like him being there in that environment and that is literally a culture of corruption. That's what that is. And at this point, like with all the people accused of these sort of acts, it's like starting to feel like looting. It's starting to feel like people came in and they're just like, get everything like a supermarket sweep of criminality. And they're just running through with their arm out, trying to get everything into the cart. And it also makes me feel like every time President Trump talks about, well, it's a witch hunt, and then you see stuff like this, like the Commerce Secretary, these are your garden variety corruption issues in the sense that it's stuff that has happened in more isolated cases in the past. So it's very hard to say that, therefore, it's a witch hunt that's politically motivated when it's pretty cut and dried. Somebody took something they weren't supposed to take.
Very rare to indict a sitting congressman, especially within 100 days of the election.
Well, as you said, they will go through the evidence and have a trial, but the timing of the email and then the phone call and then the selling of stocks is quite suspicious.
Before the bad news comes out to make the stock sink.
And the thing is with all the issues that you listed, no one can keep their nose clean, and that's been like for a long time in Washington. But like in this administration in particular, there's no message from the top to keep your nose clean. In fact, sometimes quite the opposite. And so people do not act the way they should and are tempted to act other ways and are not told otherwise.
Yeah, I think people will be surprised to discover that you can be a congressman, a fairly not so unsenior congressman, on the Energy and Commerce Committee, which regulates the drug industry, the pharmaceutical industry. And you can sit on the board of a company, you can introduce legislation, which he did incidentally before this all happened, that seems to have benefited that company, buy a lot of the stock when that legislation looks like it's going to pass. And then you get a phone call as a director from the CEO, I guess it was, and you appear to dump the stock or tell your son to dump the family stock or some chunk of it before the rest of the world knows. I mean, I don't know. Is it that much to ask that maybe congressmen shouldn't sit on boards of directors or shouldn't trade stocks?
Basic
they could just tell.
Yeah,
no, seriously,
that's
an honest question. That is, I'm personally surprised. When I went into the White House and my chief of staff to the vice president, I wasn't going to do anything that was going to affect anything. I put all my money in mutual funds. It just seemed like the obvious thing to do. You can't be like owning. What if you own a stock and something comes up? And this is an actual member of Congress. So that's one thing I would say. Maybe someone should introduce legislation to make that happen. That would not be a bad thing for Senator Schumer and Leader Pelosi on the Democratic side to try to make a fuss about and try to demand a vote on it in September. That I think is one thing that will happen.
Some people don't think the rules apply for them. I think the photo that you showed at the top of the show, Jake, that's what the streets like to call receipts. And that photo was receipts, and I think it's pretty damning and slightly incriminating. Now, the congressman currently sits in the 27th Congressional District. Sabato's crystal ball had it at a solid Republican seat. With this news, it has now moved to a likely Republican seat. I think that, folks, the Democrat in the race is already raising money off of this. And so this just goes to show that any type of conduct can open up the doors for Democrats to gain all types of seats this fall that probably weren't on the table before.
There is a culture of corruption in Washington. It did precede Donald Trump, and it is bipartisan. We've seen this before. There was that 60 Minutes report about the insider trading where you're allowed to legislate things and then trade accordingly. And the Congress did apparently try to close that loophole. And yet there's something so brazen about this, including, Mary Catherine, the fact that he allegedly lied to investigators about it, even though there's a whole paper trail and phone trail.
Right, and that's what people hate about this town, is the fact that people feel entitled to do that. And it's counterintuitively why they ended up, many of them, voting for Donald Trump, who, of course, at the time I argued was not going to be the great cleaner of this system. But it is why people looked for something completely outside the system to attempt to get them there. And I think we see over and over again that's not the case. Electorally, I would wonder whether the culture of corruption tag can have the same impact as it might have had in like a 2006 with the Mark Foley scandals, because the news cycle is so fast and so furious, and we have so many of these stories. I think we have seen the impact go down, which is regrettable to some extent.
Well,
Can I say
just the
something in
electoral
defense,
reality.
though? In defense of this town, there's also a culture of integrity in this town. What about the Justice Department?
Yeah.
They indicted. This is Trump's Justice Department.
Institutions
These are people
working.
who report to people. Yes. I mean, that's pretty impressive, actually. I've got
That
to
U.S.
say.
Attorney Berman was appointed by President Trump, and in fact had an interview with President Trump.
So I'm, would want to say that we should be a little, there is a culture of corruption, but there is also something impressive about the way the Justice Department has behaved in this and in other instances.